You think you can just disrespect me like that?
Soldiers tried to choke her. In the changing room, unaware, she was a 20-year Navy SEAL legend. The fluorescent lights in the locker hallway hummed with a cold, metallic buzz, the kind that made every sound sharper. Rows of steel lockers stretched in both directions, echoing the laughter of young soldiers who believed strength was measured by volume, not discipline. And in the dead center of that gauntlet, a woman was shoved hard against the lockers, the impact ringing like a dropped shell casing. A soldier twice her size locked an arm across her throat, his biceps bulging as he leaned in with a sneer carved from arrogance. His breath was hot, furious, the kind of rage only cowards use when the odds feel unfairly in their favor. Behind him, half a dozen uniformed recruits erupted in cheers and taunts, pointing fingers like a pack of wolves circling a lone deer. "Come on, choke her out," someone shouted, pounding a fist into a locker door. "She's not even supposed to be here," another jeered. But the woman didn't beg, didn't claw at his arm, didn't gasp or thrash. She simply braced one palm against the locker beside her, steadying herself with an almost surgical calm, so precise it looked rehearsed. Her breathing didn't spike, her eyes didn't widen. No panic, only control. A kind of stillness that didn't belong to a victim. That stillness made one soldier at the edge of the crowd hesitate. The man choking her didn't notice. He yanked her forward, jerking her by the torn fabric of her shirt. The cheap cotton ripped farther, exposing part of her shoulder just enough for a narrow strip of ink to flash beneath the white cloth. A scar, too. Thin, pale, the kind earned from a blade or shrapnel, not training drills. The laughing died just a fraction. One soldier's smile faltered. He'd seen scars like that before, but never on a new recruit. The man pinning her didn't see it. He was too busy enjoying the performance, flexing for the crowd, convinced he was showing dominance. "What's wrong?" he growled into her ear. No smart comments? No yelling? Nothing? She didn't answer. She adjusted her footing instead, sliding one boot half an inch along the floor. It was such a small movement that no one registered it, but it realigned her hips, positioned her center of gravity, and gave her leverage no untrained fighter would understand. Someone in the back whispered, "Why isn't she struggling?" No one had an answer. A dull silence thickened between the jeers. Something was off. Then the shift happened. It was invisible at first, her fingers curling lightly around the attacker's wrist, not to pry it off, but to measure pressure. Her shoulders lowering, not collapsing, but loading. Her spine straightening with a precision too flawless, too efficient. Quiet badass. Ghost discipline. The kind of posture soldiers only acquire after years of moving through rooms where hesitation gets you killed. But the recruits surrounding her weren't trained to recognize that. They only saw a woman who refused to break. The soldier choking her leaned back to gloat at the others. "See? She's nothing. Weak. All talk." He tightened his grip. 20 seconds and she's down. But the soldier standing near the end of the hallway went pale. He saw the ink again when the fabric shifted a fragment of a trident, or something that looked dangerously close to it. A mark he knew many men had died trying to earn. A mark that was not meant to exist in a place like this. Not under tearable cotton. Not under the hands of a bully. "Stop," he said quietly. No one listened. The woman finally spoke 3 words. Steady. Unshaken. "You're overextended." Before the meaning could land, her body moved with the fluid certainty of someone who had written the rules of combat themselves. She dropped her weight, twisted her hips, and used the attacker's own leverage to break his stance. In less than a heartbeat, the man who'd been choking her was slammed into the floor so hard the hallway vibrated. His friends stumbled back, startled, as if gravity had betrayed them. The woman stood over him, not triumphant, not angry, just centered, calm. And then the real silence fell. Down the hallway, a door swung open. A senior officer stepped inside, drawn by the noise, but when his gaze fell on the exposed ink on her shoulder, his face drained of color. He froze. Not because of the fight, not because she dropped a soldier twice her size, but because he recognized the mark, a Navy SEAL trident. Old style. The kind used by teams that officially didn't exist anymore. The kind worn only by operators who disappeared from rosters, missions, and sometimes from the world. He swallowed hard before speaking. "Everyone, stand at attention." The recruits stiffened instinctively, eyes snapping forward, confusion spreading like wildfire. The officer didn't look at them again. He looked only at her. "Ma'am, I didn't know you were coming." "Oh." The hallway, moments earlier filled with laughter, now held nothing but the echo of a truth too heavy to ignore. She hadn't been a victim. She had survived deployments most of them had only read about. 20 years in the dark. 20 years as a Navy SEAL they never saw coming. And now, she stood in their locker room, quiet and unbroken, as every soldier in that hallway realized the same terrifying thing. They had just laid hands on a legend. The hallway's silence lingered long after the confrontation ended, yet she resumed adjusting her torn sleeve with calm precision, ignoring the stunned faces around her as though nothing of consequence had occurred. The soldier she had floored pulled himself upright with unsteady legs, but she spared him no attention, moving with the steady, controlled rhythm of someone long accustomed to far harsher situations. The officer trailing her attempted to speak, but his voice faltered under the weight of what he had witnessed, leaving him awkwardly silent as she passed through the line of recruits who instinctively parted to make room. Their earlier bravado had collapsed into a nervous quiet, the kind that settles over a group realizing they had misjudged someone far beyond their understanding. She walked with deliberate steps, each one measured and quiet, her posture stable and efficient, revealing a discipline forged through years of operations where hesitation carried fatal consequences. The officer maintained a respectful distance behind her, unable to decide whether protocol required guidance or whether instinct demanded he keep space. She entered the auxiliary prep room without hesitation, letting the door swing closed behind her as the muted clatter of lockers faded. Inside, the air felt still, carrying only the faint smell of detergent clinging to training mats stacked neatly along the wall. She placed her bag on the bench with the careful touch of someone who valued order, then checked each item inside with brisk, methodical movements. Her multi-tool was polished from years of use, her notebook worn soft at the edges, and her canteen marked with dents that spoke of hard travel rather than sentimental value. She inspected them quickly, then aligned everything in a tight, efficient layout, maintaining a routine she had followed in far more hostile environments than a training facility. The officer hovered at the threshold, his posture stiff and uncertain, searching for the right words before finally managing, "Ma'am, the CO will need to be notified, though we weren't informed of your arrival." The hesitancy in his tone betrayed his discomfort, but she turned only slightly, answering with a controlled neutrality that left no room for interpretation. "I'm here to train," she said, her voice firm and unadorned, free of irritation or pride. It was the kind of voice used in debriefings, not conversations, and it ended the discussion immediately. The officer nodded, grateful for the clarity, then stepped back and closed the door with a cautious gentleness more suited to a hospital room than a prep area. She resumed organizing her equipment, her hands moving with the economical efficiency of someone who understood the value of routine. To an untrained observer, her actions looked ordinary. To anyone with experience, they revealed a lifetime of habits shaped by environments where preparation determined survival. She paused on a strip of faded medical tape, the handwriting nearly gone, but she tucked it away before the memory behind it could surface. When the room finally felt settled, she positioned herself near the center and began her warm-up sequence. Each movement was controlled and deliberate, combining strength, mobility, and balance with the smooth precision of a seasoned operator. Her breathing remained steady, her tempo consistent, revealing a level of conditioning none of the recruits outside could hope to match. Beyond the door, whispered speculation gathered, like static. One soldier pressed his ear to the wood, expecting to hear heavy exertion, yet her steps remained nearly silent, betraying none of the strain her controlled movements required. "How is she that calm?" he whispered, the unease in his voice unmistakable. Another recruit lowered his head, remembering the sliver of ink beneath her torn shirt, a mark too specific, too earned, and far too dangerous to ignore. "Because she's not like us," he muttered. "She's something completely different." Inside, she finished her final stretch, shook out her arms, and tightened the strap on her bag before approaching the door. She understood the attention awaiting her outside, and knew she could no longer rely on anonymity to avoid unwanted questions. Still, she felt no fear or frustration, only the familiar pressure of slipping back into a world she thought she had left behind. Her objective had been simple: complete the program quietly, avoid recognition, and remain another face in the crowd. But confrontation had altered the trajectory, forcing her into visibility she never sought. Recognition meant questions. Questions meant history, and her history was classified for reasons most soldiers would never understand. She reached for the door, her hand steady and her expression unreadable, bracing for the shift awaiting her on the other side. She did not walk like a victim or a legend, but like a professional returning to the only structure that had ever made sense: routine, discipline, and silence. Because after 20 years moving through the shadows of Navy SEAL operations, routine was the anchor that kept her focused, and silence was the armor that had kept her alive. And as she stepped forward, she carried that silence with her, ready to face the training yard as the ghost she had always been. When she stepped out of the prep room and re-entered the training corridor, the shift in atmosphere was immediate, carrying a mix of unease, forced confidence, and the lingering arrogance of recruits unwilling to adjust their assumptions. She walked with the same steady cadence she had maintained through countless deployments, ignoring the side glances and half-whispered remarks that drifted through the hallway like static, carrying more insecurity than substance. Several recruits straightened their posture as she passed, yet their eyes revealed the stubborn denial of men trying to convince themselves that the earlier hallway incident had been nothing more than luck. One soldier leaned toward his friend with a smirk, insisting she had caught the attacker off guard, his tone sharp with the brittle confidence common among those who feared the truth more than the confrontation itself. Another recruit, emboldened by the group's tension, muttered about special treatment and soft instructors, clinging to excuses rather than acknowledging the possibility that her skills exceeded theirs by a wide margin. She processed the comments without reaction, treating them as background noise, just as she had treated similar assumptions from officers who underestimated her long before these recruits were old enough to enlist. When she stepped into the main training yard, the sun cast sharp lines across the asphalt, revealing clusters of recruits who fell silent at her approach, their earlier bravado replaced by poorly concealed curiosity. The instructor stood at the far end of the yard, clipboard in hand, his voice wavering for a moment as he recognized her from the incident already spreading through the facility. She moved toward the formation with controlled precision, her steps consistent and measured, each one aligning with years of conditioning that prioritized efficiency over display. A tall recruit stepped deliberately into her path, attempting to force her to react, his posture projecting false dominance built on the thin foundation of group approval. "Try not to drag the rest of us down today," he said, his voice holding a smug confidence that wavered slightly under the weight of her steady gaze. His friends snickered behind him, mistaking his attempt at intimidation for leadership, though even he seemed unsure whether the performance still comforted him. She stepped to the side without a word, bypassing him smoothly, denying him the reaction he sought. The instructor called out the day's first drill, a timed navigation test requiring each recruit to read terrain markers through the wooded ridge beyond the facility. The recruits moved toward the supply table, jostling for position as though speed at the table would translate into performance on the course. She joined the line quietly, observing the procedure with the same calm focus she applied to mission briefings, never breaking posture or pace. A pair of recruits ahead of her exchanged glances, whispering comments about babysitting and dead weight, their voices sharp with the defensive humor soldiers used when fear edged too close for comfort. She accepted the map and compass when they reached her, folding the map with efficient precision and securing it beneath her arm without wasting motion. The youngest recruit in line watched her closely, his brow tightening with recognition as he noted the discipline in her movements, though he said nothing and held his place. She moved with the group toward the ridge, matching the incline with steady breath control while several recruits behind continued their misguided commentary. One particularly vocal recruit jogged beside her, maintaining a loud stream of condescending remarks about directional awareness and rookie mistakes, clearly hoping to provoke a misstep or break her composure. She kept her focus forward, ignoring him as she maintained a consistent breathing rhythm, adjusting her stride for the terrain without looking down. As they reached the tree line, the instructor delivered the final set of instructions, then ordered the group to disperse. They failed to recognize the subtle efficiency of her movements or the fact that she had already identified 3 possible routes before the instructor finished speaking. She advanced deeper into the forest with steady, quiet steps, letting the noise of the others fade behind her as she moved with the controlled awareness of someone trained to operate alone in hostile terrain. The recruits remained convinced of their superiority, unaware that labels lose their power when applied to someone built to survive without them. She continued forward, her posture stable and her breathing even, fully aware that the real test had already begun, not the navigation drill, but the slow unraveling of every assumption they had made about her. The forest absorbed noise with the thick, muted pressure she recognized immediately, signaling terrain where awareness mattered more than speed or confidence. She advanced with deliberate pacing, letting her eyes move through controlled sectors rather than sweeping the environment broadly like the recruits scattering behind her. Her compass aligned cleanly on the bearing she selected, and she folded the map into a tight square that slid beneath her sleeve for quick retrieval without sacrificing hand readiness. She kept her breathing steady as she moved, adjusting to the incline with instinctive foot placement that avoided loose dirt, brittle sticks, and exposed roots capable of betraying her presence. The ground cover shifted beneath her boots with predictable softness, allowing her to maintain near-silent movement, while the recruits behind her cracked branches and scuffed soil with careless enthusiasm. Their scattered voices bounced between the trees in uneven bursts, revealing exactly who was moving too fast, who was already winded, and who lacked the composure to think while navigating uneven ground. The first anomaly appeared as a sharp drop in ambient noise ahead, forming an unnatural corridor, where even the wind seemed to hesitate before cutting through the pines. She slowed her pace by a fraction, scanning the terrain with a measured pattern that assessed tree spacing, light angles, and possible movement channels without wasting energy. The soil near a cluster of roots showed a faint disturbance, suggesting earlier passage rather than random wildlife activity. She didn't crouch fully. Instead, she shifted her weight and traced the direction with 2 fingers, confirming the impression was human and slightly rushed. The recruit responsible had deviated from the assigned route and pushed east toward unstable slope zones, likely trying to compensate for poor initial navigation without understanding the terrain. She resumed her pace, letting the forest dictate her movement tempo, rather than the artificial sense of urgency driving the recruits. When a faint metallic strike echoed through the trees, she recognized the sound instantly, equipment hitting stone at a downward angle strong enough to misalign a compass needle. It told her someone ahead had already lost control of their footing or attention. As she pushed deeper, the tree spacing tightened and narrowed her line of sight, prompting her to adjust her scan height to mid-level, where panicked movement normally appeared first. The second anomaly emerged near a natural choke point formed by 2 moss-covered boulders. A section of foliage showed a clean break in multiple stems, indicating someone had pushed through without slowing. She analyzed the break angle, identifying forward momentum rather than lateral misstep. That meant the recruit wasn't simply navigating poorly. He was accelerating in the wrong direction, likely trying to regain confidence by increasing speed. Speed on poor footing rarely ended well. The terrain sloped downward near the midpoint of the ridge, exposing loose shale that demanded narrow, deliberate steps. She examined a fresh slide mark in the dirt, an elongated smear angled sharply downhill, created by a boot that had lost traction under pressure. She noted the direction, estimated the stride, and concluded the recruit had recovered his balance, but continued moving downhill with compromised stability. She didn't chase him or break her course. She simply recalibrated her mental map and prepared for potential contact. Experience had taught her that inexperienced movement always created predictable outcomes, especially on terrain that punished overconfidence more quickly than any instructor could. As she advanced, she performed a quick wind check by lifting her chin slightly and feeling the airflow shift across her cheek, confirming the breeze carried sound downhill and would mask her approach from anyone ahead who was panicking. The forest grew still again, marking the convergence zone where anomalies aligned into a pattern she knew too well. Someone was off-route, disoriented, and heading toward increasingly unstable ground. She stepped over a fallen branch with minimal movement signature, keeping her center of gravity low and her pace controlled, allowing the silence to guide her next assessment. The absence of wildlife noise in this sector confirmed one additional truth. The terrain's disturbance had escalated enough to push animals deeper into cover, suggesting the recruit had been moving erratically for several minutes. She continued forward without altering her breathing or pace, her awareness sharpening as she reached the section of the ridge where all indicators pointed toward one outcome. A recruit ahead was no longer navigating but reacting, and reaction under stress in terrain like this always carried consequences. Her posture remained steady, Her hands relaxed, and her attention locked on the environment rather than the voices fading behind her. Because anomalies in terrain never appeared without cause, and she had spent 20 years learning that the forest rarely lied about the trouble it was trying to signal. Every broken stem, shifted root, and misplaced step told the same story, and she followed that story with the calm precision of someone who had lived too long in places where awareness was the only barrier between order and disaster. The ridge steepened quickly as she advanced, forcing her to narrow her stance and shorten each step to maintain traction on the loose shale. She listened for deviations in the forest's rhythm, filtering ambient noise through practiced instinct that identified stress patterns long before most recruits realized something was wrong. The first impact arrived abruptly, a heavy, uneven thud, followed by the cascading clatter of dislodged stones sliding downhill in an uncontrolled pattern. She halted instantly, anchoring her weight behind one boot, while evaluating the echo's direction, distance, and likely terrain angle through the sound's split-second distortion. Another collapse followed, sharper and faster, confirming that someone ahead had lost footing and was accelerating into unstable ground without the ability to self-correct. She shifted course diagonally to retain elevation, choosing a controlled approach path that minimized exposure to the slope's weakest zones. The soil patterns confirmed her suspicion: bent saplings, displaced needles, and a rapid sequence of missteps that marked rising panic rather than measured movement. She followed the track with precision, reading each sign as cleanly as she would a tactical map, her focus narrowing as the ridge transitioned into a shallow ravine bordered by brittle stone. A strained gasp cut through the silence, followed by the hollow thump of a body impacting a rocky ledge, indicating the recruit had landed hard but remained conscious. She advanced with increased caution, keeping her steps low and centered as she reached a vantage point overlooking the drop. The recruit clung desperately to a narrow rock shelf, his boots sliding helplessly across unstable shale that offered no traction. She scanned the surrounding terrain in a fast, disciplined sweep, identifying load-bearing footholds, anchor points, and the projected shift pattern of the loose debris beneath him. "Hold position," she said, her voice firm enough to interrupt his rising panic without adding unnecessary pressure. "You move, the shelf fails." The recruit froze, chest heaving as he tried to steady his grip, though the tremor in his arms signaled he lacked the strength to maintain it for long. Extending her arms slowly, she kept her posture locked and her hips aligned to absorb sudden load shifts. "Grip my wrist," she instructed, keeping her tone precise. "Pulling anywhere else compromises the slope." The recruit obeyed immediately, wrapping his hand around her wrist with a weak but desperate hold. She braced against the incline, exhaled once to stabilize her core, and lifted with smooth, controlled leverage that relied on angle rather than force. She guided him to a firmer patch of soil 2 meters above the slide zone, maintaining tension until his boots found stable ground and his breathing leveled into shaky but coherent rhythm. He tried to speak, but she cut him off with a single directive that re-established control before his adrenaline could turn to apologies. "Check your footing. Reorient before you move." He nodded quickly, still avoiding her eyes, shifting his weight slowly as he tested the ground beneath him with trembling precision. She didn't wait for him to stand. She rose immediately, scanning the ridge again and performing a quick wind check that confirmed sound would continue drifting downhill, masking movement for anyone farther ahead. Her gaze tracked the forest for additional anomalies, broken stems, irregular spacing, or abrupt changes in soil density. But the sector remained stable, suggesting the incident had been isolated rather than the start of a broader chain reaction. The recruit behind her finally regained his balance, but she was already advancing, her pace smooth and consistent as she resumed her original heading without acknowledging the difficulty of the extraction. She understood the importance of leaving no emotional mark on the moment. Recruits learned more effectively through quiet correction than drawn-out lectures, especially in terrain that punished hesitation. The ridge had offered its first warning, and she accepted it with the same calm precision she applied to every operational environment she had ever moved through. Her boots found their rhythm again as she ascended, maintaining the same silent cadence that had defined every movement since entering the forest. The first break had come exactly where she expected, caused not by danger, but by overconfidence, and she knew the rest of the day would reveal which recruits could adapt and which would crumble under pressure. She continued uphill with the steady discipline of someone who had survived far more demanding terrain, allowing the forest silence to settle behind her as she prepared for whatever came next. The ridge leveled gradually as she advanced, allowing her stride to return to its controlled, quiet cadence, while the forest settled into a steady, predictable rhythm. She maintained a consistent scan pattern across the tree line, checking shadow movement, ground texture, and potential choke points that could influence the group's approach to the waypoint. Behind her, the rescued recruit recovered his footing and began moving with slower, tighter steps, every motion revealing the sharpened caution of someone recently reminded of the terrain's capacity to punish overconfidence. His earlier arrogance had evaporated completely, replaced by disciplined silence as he followed her path without attempting to overtake or regain lost pride. He replayed the rescue with growing clarity, the controlled descent, the firm directives, the precision of each foothold, and understood with uncomfortable certainty that she had operated at a level far beyond the skill set of the average recruit. He didn't voice the realization, but the shift in his posture made the acknowledgement unmistakable. Two recruits ahead turned at the sound of movement and stalled briefly when they saw who he was trailing. Their expressions tightened as they read his changed demeanor, abandoning whatever jokes they had prepared. The quick shake of his head served as both warning and explanation, telling them wordlessly that their assumptions about her no longer matched the reality he had witnessed. She sensed the change without looking back, recognizing the subtle weight shift in their steps and the absence of careless chatter that had filled the earlier hours. Respect seldom arrived openly in groups like this. It surfaced first in silence, in the steady recalibration of posture, and in the instinctive decision to give space to someone operating at a higher standard. A break in the canopy ahead created a clean shaft of light that marked her next reference point, and she paused briefly to verify her bearing before continuing toward the waypoint. The recruits behind her adjusted their spacing automatically, maintaining a steady interval without crowding, revealing a newfound understanding of her presence and capability. The instructor's whistle echoed through the forest with sharp clarity, signaling the regroup phase of the exercise. The call triggered inconsistent reactions among the scattered soldiers, yet she held her pace, navigating with the same quiet efficiency she had maintained throughout the ridge. The recruits behind her increased speed slightly, though none attempted to pass her or reassert dominance. The instructor observed the shift instantly. He scanned the group, noting the tightened posture, the lowered voices, and the sudden absence of careless bravado, recognizing that something meaningful had occurred without requiring a detailed report. He met her gaze briefly, receiving a minimal acknowledgement before she shifted her attention back to the forest perimeter. She positioned herself slightly outside the cluster, establishing the same operational distance she preferred in any unfamiliar environment. Even at that distance, she felt the shift in their attention no longer dismissive or mocking, but quietly recalibrated, shaped by the evidence they had reluctantly accepted. Respect earned through competence always traveled faster than explanations. One recruit approached her cautiously, stopping just short of her peripheral boundary. His voice was controlled but uncertain as he said, "You stabilized on that slope like you'd done it 100 times." She answered without turning fully, keeping her tone concise and tactical. Stability comes from reading terrain, not speed. Her reply ended the conversation before it drifted into unnecessary commentary, and the recruit returned to formation with a noticeably straighter posture. She performed another quick scan of the clearing, checking noise direction, ground firmness, and approach vectors leading into the next phase of the drill. The recruits mirrored her stillness, carrying themselves with quieter discipline as they waited for instructions, their earlier assumptions replaced by a deeper, more grounded awareness. The instructor raised his whistle for the next command, but she was already shifting her stance, mentally preparing for the following stage. The line had begun to change not through confrontation or authority, but through the quiet, unambiguous clarity of proven capability. And though she neither sought acknowledgement nor intended to influence them, the ridge had delivered its lesson clearly. Respect, once earned through action, never drifted back into doubt. The instructor lowered his whistle and laid out the parameters for the next drill, a timed navigation and retrieval course requiring efficient route selection, terrain interpretation, and disciplined movement across multiple concealed checkpoints. The recruits shifted uneasily, still recalibrating after the earlier incident, while she stood slightly apart from the formation, her posture composed and ready. When the signal sounded, the recruits burst forward with uneven urgency, scattering through the tree line in a mix of hesitation and overcorrection. She moved immediately but without acceleration, allowing terrain cues to dictate her pace as she drifted into the forest with controlled, near-silent footwork that exploited the natural density of the undergrowth. Her first target lay along a shallow rise marked by subtle depressions in the soil, indicating previous movement during the marker placement. She analyzed the pattern quickly, identifying the direction of travel and the likely concealment point. Instead of following the obvious central path, she angled toward a tighter line where root coverage provided firmer traction and reduced noise signature. Her steps landed cleanly, allowing her to close distance faster than the recruits relying on speed instead of terrain advantage. Behind her, heavy footfalls and scattered curses revealed the predictable mistakes overstriding, misreading slope angles, and fighting the ground instead of using it. She ignored the noise completely, maintaining a steady breath cycle as she ascended toward the first marker. She spotted it immediately from the unnatural compression of a fern cluster and retrieved it with a quick, efficient motion before updating her mental map for the next objective. Her second heading required navigating a narrow corridor bordered by uneven rock outcroppings. She performed a brief wind check with a slight tilt of her chin, confirming sound drift would favor her movement. She adjusted her route accordingly, moving along the corridor's firmer interior line where foot placement required minimal correction. The marker lay concealed beneath a fallen branch, its position exposed only by the unnatural alignment of disturbed bark. She secured it instantly and continued without breaking tempo. The third route crossed a shallow ravine where loose soil created instability for anyone approaching directly. She avoided the main descent entirely, choosing a diagonal traverse toward a cluster of exposed roots, offering stable points of contact. Her weight remained centered as she crossed, each step measured to prevent slide risk. Two recruits attempted to mimic her approach but lacked timing, causing one to slip and arrest his fall with an awkward grab that delayed both. She cleared the ravine and moved along the ridge, maintaining elevation while scanning the forest for motion density, debris patterns, and probable recruit paths. Her awareness extended forward in a structured sweep left sector, midline right sector, allowing her to identify the third marker before any other recruit entered its vicinity. She collected it efficiently, pivoting toward the final objective before the others reached the clearing's edge. Voices rose faintly from deeper in the woods as recruits realized multiple markers were missing, their confusion increasing as they tried to reconstruct routes she had already completed. Their frustration provided further clues to their locations and speeds, helping her refine her trajectory toward the final checkpoint. She located the last marker near a grouping of moss-covered stones, positioned just far enough off the natural trail to mislead anyone relying solely on sight. She retrieved it with a clean motion, scanned the terrain one last time, and shifted into a controlled descent toward the clearing, her breathing steady despite the extended movement cycle. When she stepped out of the tree line, the instructor's attention snapped toward her with a flicker of recognition, registering the fact that she had completed the full circuit before any other recruit approached the halfway point. She handed him all 4 coded strips without theatrics, offering only a succinct nod before stepping aside. The instructor examined the markers, his posture tightening as he confirmed she had executed the drill flawlessly. Several recruits emerged moments later, winded and visibly disoriented, their expressions shifting sharply when they saw her already standing in the clearing with an unbroken posture. They scanned the tree line as though expecting someone else to appear beside her, unwilling to accept how quickly she had completed the course. Whispered disbelief spread through the formation, followed by the heavy quiet that accompanied dawning comprehension. She remained at the perimeter, monitoring the clearing and recalculating light angles while the rest of the group processed what had occurred. The respect that had begun forming earlier now solidified into something more concrete, driven not by fear or mystique, but by the undeniable clarity of superior skill, demonstrated without intent to impress. Her stance stayed calm, her breathing even, her eyes tracking the terrain rather than the recruits, reminding anyone paying attention that her performance was not a display, but a habit built through years of disciplined repetition. And for the first time, the entire group understood they were standing beside someone whose capabilities reached far beyond the boundaries of a simple training drill. The instructor announced a brief reset before the next phase, giving the recruits time to recover while the clearing settled into a tense, measured quiet. She remained near the tree line, positioning herself at an angle that allowed full visibility of the group without drawing unnecessary attention. Her breathing stayed steady as she scanned the perimeter, reading movement patterns rather than facial expressions. Clusters of recruits formed quickly, their stances revealing frustration more clearly than their muffled conversations. Shoulders lifted too high, feet planted too wide, and restless shifting signaled a collective struggle to process how decisively she had completed the course. They weren't analyzing terrain failures or technique gaps, they were recalibrating ego, which often produced more instability than any physical drill. One recruit, the same soldier who had mocked her earlier, exhibited the most visible breakdown in posture. His gait tightened, his jaw locked, and his arms stayed rigid at his sides, indicating a mix of embarrassment and rising aggression. He tracked her position with peripheral glances rather than direct stares, a behavior she recognized from countless confrontations where pride reached its limit before discipline intervened. He stepped forward abruptly, cutting through the group with a stride that carried more force than balance. The recruits around him instinctively widened their spacing, creating an unspoken boundary shaped by uncertainty rather than intention. The shift drew the instructor's attention immediately, prompting him to monitor the situation with sharp, quiet focus. She registered the tall recruit's approach through sound and subtle changes in group alignment, adjusting her stance by a fraction to maintain stability without signaling engagement. Her weight centered over her spine, her hands relaxed, and her field of view widened to include both the recruit and the instructor in a single controlled sweep. "Sir, with respect," the tall soldier said, directing his voice toward the instructor while keeping his posture angled toward her. The course wasn't balanced. Some markers were harder to reach than others. His tone carried restrained hostility, but his body position revealed the real target of his frustration. The instructor maintained a neutral stance, his reply calm and immediate. "The course follows a standardized layout. Every participant faced the same terrain." His voice held the assertive steadiness of someone unwilling to let grievance dictate procedure. But the soldier wasn't searching for fairness. He was searching for justification that might restore the pride he had lost. The recruit's shoulders shifted as he redirected his weight, taking a step closer while flicking his eyes toward her with a deliberate, testing motion. "Some people here had advantages, the rest of us didn't," he said, his voice projecting outward to ensure everyone heard the implication. "That changes the evaluation." She kept her breathing measured and her gaze on a fixed point beyond the clearing, refusing to let small provocation dictate her response. Her silence, grounded in discipline rather than defiance, created a sharper pressure than any verbal counter, which only deepened the soldier's frustration. Several recruits exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the moment approaching its stress threshold. The instructor attempted to redirect the situation with a firm statement. "Performance reflects preparation. If you want improvement, you earn it through repetition." His tone carried enough authority to halt most arguments, but the tall recruit had already crossed the line between frustration and challenge. He pivoted fully toward her now, abandoning the pretense of addressing the instructor. "What's your background? You moved through that course like you'd been doing it for years." His words carried accusation rather than curiosity, revealing his inability to accept that skill could exist without explanation. The recruits around him stiffened, recognizing the confrontation's escalation through the tightening of his stance and the angle of his shoulders. She continued monitoring him with peripheral awareness, noting the tension in his neck and the shift in his breathing pattern, clear indicators that he was ready to push further. He stepped closer, lowering his voice but sharpening its edge. "You trying to make the rest of us look incompetent?" Her response came only after a controlled pause, her head turning just enough to meet his eyes while maintaining a neutral posture. "No one needs help appearing incompetent," she said evenly. "Your decisions handle that on their own." The clearing fell silent, the statement landing with the clean, surgical precision of an operator delivering truth without emotion. The tall recruit faltered, his glare losing focus as the accuracy of her remark cut through whatever narrative he had built to protect his pride. The recruits surrounding him backed away slightly, their reactions grounded in recognition rather than fear. The instructor intervened before the soldier could recover his momentum. "Enough. Reset positions. Next phase begins in 5. His voice carried finality that left no room for further challenge. She returned her gaze to the tree line, already shifting her focus toward the terrain rather than the confrontation. The recruits watched her with a new combination of respect and caution, no longer dismissive, no longer amused, but quietly aware that her presence challenged their assumptions more effectively than any lecture could. The tension remained in the clearing, but it had transformed, revealing a fault line running directly through pride rather than capability. And as the group reset their positions, they understood the truth none of them had recognized before. She didn't need to assert authority, her discipline made it impossible to ignore. The instructor assembled the recruits for the next evolution, outlining a controlled stress sequence that blended rapid transitions, weighted footwork drills, and short problem-solving assessments. She maintained her position near the tree line, ensuring clear visibility of both the group and the surrounding terrain, while keeping her breathing steady and her posture neutral. The recruits formed a loose semicircle, their movements restrained by the residual tension created from earlier phases. As the instructor demonstrated the first drill, the sharp cadence of his footfalls carried across the clearing with a pattern she recognized instantly, a four-step rhythm, ending in a controlled pivot that matched advanced mobility training from an entirely different environment. She didn't react outwardly, but her eyes narrowed slightly as her internal charting adjusted to accommodate the familiar sequence. The sound did not trigger emotion, it simply activated dormant conditioning. A second impact followed, the weight distribution almost identical to landing drills, performed on reinforced sand designed to replicate ship deck stability under movement stress. She registered the pattern with precise detachment, noting how easily her body aligned with the rhythm despite the years since she had last executed those drills. Her right hand made a small, unconscious alignment adjustment index finger, tracking along her thumb an old readiness gesture ingrained through repetition rather than memory. The recruits remained unaware of the shift, interpreting her controlled stillness as simple focus, but the instructor caught the subtle change in her stance. His gaze lingered for a fraction of a second before he resumed speaking, understanding without comment that her reaction came from a level of training far beyond the standard curriculum. He transitioned into a movement demonstration, involving rapid directional changes under load, a drill requiring balanced foot placement and weight transfer, without compromising stability. Most recruits attempted to mimic the sequence with limited success, their steps too heavy and their timing inconsistent. She observed silently, recognizing not the drill itself, but the structure nearly identical to shipborne balance assessments used to test stability during high-tempo maritime operations. The cadence triggered another brief flicker, crisp, clipped commands layered beneath ambient forest noise, the kind spoken in narrow corridors or tight breach points where communication needed maximum efficiency. She didn't chase the memory, she simply allowed the fragment to pass, the way a professional filters background radio traffic during coordinated movement. Her breathing leveled again as the edges of the recall receded into the practiced calm she had maintained all morning. When the instructor requested demonstration partners, the recruits hesitated, their glances shifting toward her with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. He called her forward without hesitation, choosing her with the deliberate calm of someone who understood exactly how much she could handle. She stepped into position with the same controlled efficiency that had defined every movement since dawn, her center of gravity aligned naturally as she faced the demonstration area. The soil beneath her boots briefly overlaid with another texture, grainy, hot, compacted by repeated training cycles, but she grounded the recall with a subtle exhale, allowing only the functional aspects of the memory to remain. She shifted her weight slightly, resetting her stance to match the terrain rather than the echo of the past. As the instructor demonstrated the first maneuver, she matched his pace with precise, economical movements, each shift in direction executed with the same fluidity she had once used during far more demanding drills. The recruits watched with near-silent attention, sensing a deeper level of conditioning guiding her actions but unable to identify its origin. They saw refined skill, but not the years of operational repetition shaping every micro-adjustment of her posture. Her footwork remained stable, even during rapid directional changes, her torque controlled, her balance unwavering. She corrected angles instinctively, aligning her hips and shoulders with minimal motion, the way operators were trained to conserve energy under sustained load. The instructor noted each detail, recognizing adjustments too subtle for standard training backgrounds. His jaw tightened slightly, a sign he understood she was masking deeper training beneath a controlled exterior. When the final sequence ended, She stepped back with the same quiet efficiency she had carried all morning, revealing nothing of the brief internal echoes triggered by the drill. The recruits attempted the sequence afterward, their movements clumsy in comparison, prompting several to exchange glances that acknowledged what none were ready to say out loud. She wasn't simply skilled, she was conditioned, but she kept the truth contained, allowing only the surface to show, revealing enough competence to command respect while withholding the history that had forged it. The memory fragments settled back into place, leaving her posture calm and her focus forward, as though nothing unusual had surfaced at all. And though the recruits lacked the vocabulary to describe the shift they sensed, they felt it unmistakably, the presence of someone shaped far beyond the limits of their training, carrying echoes of environments none of them had endured. The instructor had barely completed the final demonstration when a sharp, controlled whistle cut across the clearing, carrying a tone that immediately shifted the recruit's posture into rigid attention. She adjusted her stance by a fraction, eyes scanning the perimeter with the calm, disciplined awareness of someone trained to respond first with observation rather than motion. A senior officer stepped from the tree line, his uniform marked by rank the recruits rarely encountered outside inspections, and his gait carried the steady authority of a man accustomed to evaluating multiple units under pressure. The instructor straightened instantly, confirming that this arrival had not been part of the scheduled training plan. The recruits whispered briefly, then fell silent as the commander approached the center of the clearing. She remained still, tracking his stride with peripheral precision, noting the subtle weight distribution patterns that marked experienced leadership heel to midfoot landings, minimal lateral sway, and controlled breathing. When his gaze passed over the formation, he paused slightly longer on her, assessing without overt scrutiny, reading posture and stance more carefully than the others realized. He stepped closer, stopping at a range that allowed detailed evaluation. "You're the one they mentioned," he said, his tone even and stripped of unnecessary phrasing. She met his stare without tension, her breathing steady and her posture balanced, offering only a neutral acknowledgement. "Sir." The commander circled her with minimal movement, his eyes tracking the micro-adjustments most soldiers didn't know they made: shoulder alignment under load, stance stability on uneven ground, and the absence of wasted motion while idle. "You cleared the course faster than projected metrics," he said quietly. "Explain that." "I read terrain efficiently, sir," she replied, giving an answer accurate enough to satisfy procedure, but empty enough to block deeper inquiry. "Efficient reading doesn't account for that gap," he replied without irritation, "only fact." His head tilted slightly, revealing controlled curiosity. "Unless you've trained elsewhere." She did not respond. Silence in this context was safer than any crafted explanation. The commander recognized the deliberate withholding but didn't push, his expression settling into the calm patience of someone who understood operational boundaries. He turned to the instructor with a single nod. "Run the last sequence again. Add full load." There was no emphasis and no challenge, only evaluation. The instructor obeyed immediately. The recruit stepped back, forming a wider arc as she moved to the starting point. She tightened the harness with efficient precision, checking strap compression and friction points with the practiced speed of someone accustomed to far heavier gear. The commander observed these micro-movements closely, noting each adjustment with growing certainty. Before the whistle sounded, he spoke again low enough that only she could hear. "Your footwork patterns aren't standard. They track closer to maritime units." His tone held no accusation, only recognition. "And your reaction timing isn't something gained through routine drills." "My record is complete within the system, sir," she replied, meeting his eyes without shifting her stance. "Paperwork completes itself," he said quietly. "Patterns don't." The whistle cut through the clearing, and she launched into the movement cycle with immediate, controlled acceleration. She absorbed the load smoothly, angling her hips to stabilize torque and adjusting stride length automatically as the terrain shifted. Her breathing remained constant, her movements sharp but economical, revealing conditioning built through repetition rather than raw athleticism. The commander watched everything: her knee alignment under pressure, her micro-corrections on unstable soil, the absence of hesitation before directional change, and the clean transition between acceleration points. Each detail confirmed what reports could only imply. She completed the sequence faster than the instructor expected, even with increased load, finishing with controlled deceleration that revealed more discipline than exertion. The recruits stared in silence, their earlier speculation replaced by stark recognition that her capabilities were far beyond their frame of reference. The commander stepped forward, his expression more focused now, the evaluation complete. "You move like someone who's done this under conditions far less forgiving," he said, his voice low but certain. "This isn't your first environment like this." She held his gaze, offering no reaction beyond steady stillness, neither confirming nor denying, only letting silence carry the weight she refused to speak aloud. The commander exhaled once, not in frustration, but in understanding. "We'll discuss this later," he said, before turning toward the instructor with the decisive assurance of someone who had confirmed exactly what he suspected. The recruit shifted uneasily, realizing for the first time that whatever she was hiding wasn't myth or exaggeration, it was history carved into her body with the precision of long-term conditioning, far beyond anything they knew. The formation tightened unevenly after the commander stepped back, revealing gaps shaped less by confusion than by quiet recalibration. She remained at the perimeter, maintaining a grounded stance, while her eyes tracked subtle posture changes across the group, elevated shoulders, widened steps, and shallow breaths signaling rising uncertainty. The atmosphere shifted from simple discipline to controlled tension, the kind that precedes questions no one wants to ask aloud. The instructor attempted to resume the sequence, but the cadence of the group had altered noticeably, the earlier rhythm replaced by careful, deliberate movements shaped by the commander's unexpected scrutiny. She scanned the area without turning her head, reading the distribution of weight in the recruits' stances, and noting how quickly authority changed their internal balance. At the center of the clearing, the commander exchanged a low-voiced briefing with the instructor, the clipped cadence of their conversation carrying hints of evaluation rather than correction. She registered tone and pattern rather than content, recognizing the quiet decisiveness of officers who discussed matters requiring minimal visibility. The commander's posture remained stable chin level, shoulders squared, and arms quiet, indicating he had not come to supervise. He had come to verify. When he approached her again, his steps revealed more than his expression. He kept his heel to midfoot alignment precise, minimizing lateral motion, an unconscious habit common among operators trained to conserve momentum. He stopped at a deliberate distance that granted both authority and observational advantage. "We're adjusting the next sequence," he said, voice calm. "You'll run with the instructor. Direct comparison." The recruits stiffened collectively, recognizing the deviation from protocol even if they didn't grasp its significance. She offered a controlled nod, neither accepting nor resisting, only acknowledging the order with the neutrality of someone long accustomed to scrutiny. The instructor moved to the starting line, his stance shifting subtly as he prepared for evaluation he knew wasn't directed at him. She stepped beside him with precise alignment, matching her foot placement to the terrain's density to ensure silent traction. Her breathing remained linear, her shoulders relaxed, her awareness extended across the entire clearing. When the whistle sounded, she launched forward at a measured pace, syncing with the instructor's rhythm before gradually adjusting to an efficiency-driven pattern. Her stride absorbed pressure cleanly, minimizing vertical displacement while maintaining lateral stability across uneven soil. The commander watched both trajectories closely, comparing their footwork, weight shifts, and directional transitions with clinical precision. The instructor accelerated into the second segment, executing practiced movements with discipline, but she maintained proximity without strain, her adjustments emerging through micro-corrections invisible to untrained eyes. She anticipated terrain changes by reading surface tension and ground compression patterns, shifting her hips a breath before the soil gave way. At the halfway point, she made a fraction-degree pivot to counter an upcoming slope dip, a movement so subtle it vanished beneath the drill's broader motion. But the commander caught it instantly, his eyes tightening a fraction as he recognized anticipatory compensation, a trait found only in units trained for rapid adaptation environments. They completed the cycle, the instructor exhaling heavily while she stabilized her breathing within seconds. Her recovery remained flat and controlled, revealing conditioning developed through long-term repetition rather than standard training. The commander approached her again, this time observing from a closer angle, checking boot alignment, shoulder symmetry, and micro-tremors that might indicate exertion. He found none. "You adjusted before the shift occurred," he said quietly. "That's not reactive movement." "I followed terrain indicators, sir," she replied, offering the least revealing explanation possible. "That explains the surface," he answered, "not the timing." Several recruits listened from the edges, unable to decipher the technical exchange but sensing the weight behind it. They didn't understand what the commander recognized, but they understood that he was no longer questioning her competence, he was confirming her origin. He stepped around her, assessing her stance the way seasoned commanders evaluate personnel trained under classified or specialized conditions. "Your distribution remains consistent under load," he said, his tone low. "That's characteristic of individuals taught to operate in shifting environments. Very few learn that." She didn't answer. Silence, at this level, was a tool more effective than any explanation. The commander shifted into her field of view again, his expression neutral but sharpened by realization. "I've seen this pattern before," he said softly, "in units that don't advertise their rosters." Her jaw tightened by a minimal margin barely visible, but clear enough for the commander to register. The instructor noticed it too, though he offered no reaction, understanding the gravity behind such subtle cues. The commander didn't push further. Instead, he exhaled through his nose, a slow, controlled release that suggested confirmation rather than suspicion. "We'll proceed," he said quietly, but with adjustments. The recruits exchanged glances, their instincts tightening as they sensed a shift they couldn't name. The tension didn't just increase, it refined, becoming sharper, cleaner, focused entirely around her. And though no one said it aloud, the clearing felt different now, as if every tree around them had begun listening, waiting for the truth that hovered just outside the commander's final sentence. Something wasn't simply being hinted at. Something was beginning to surface. The recruits stood frozen in place, their postures stiffening with instinctive caution, while she remained exactly where she had been, balanced and unreadable, embodying the discipline of someone who understood the power of stillness far more than the power of speech. He surveyed the field slowly, taking time to examine the spacing, the posture, and the uneasy formation that had formed around her throughout the last hour. Nothing about the arrangement was intentional, yet everything about it was revealing no one stood too close, no one tried to claim proximity, and no one pretended they understood what invisible line they had sensed and respected without being told. The instructor felt the shift too, his breathing controlled but noticeably lower in the chest, the instinctive response of a man who recognized the presence of something outside his normal command structure. He clasped his hands behind his back, subtly repositioning his stance into something closer to parade rest, though the commander had given no such order. When the commander finally spoke, his voice carried the steady resonance of authority shaped by decades of operational exposure. "Clear the central field," he said, not raising his tone even slightly. "Everyone holds position except her." The command landed with quiet precision, prompting immediate movement from the instructor and a momentary freeze from the recruits who were unsure if they had heard correctly. Then training overtook hesitation, and the group shifted outward, creating a wide perimeter that left her standing alone in the open while the forest framed her like a silent witness. She did not react externally, but her internal awareness expanded, tracing the edges of the clearing, the breathing patterns of the recruits, and the commander's center of gravity as he approached. Her posture remained neutral, balanced evenly on both feet, revealing no intention and no fear, only readiness. The commander stopped several feet from her, maintaining a respectful distance that suggested recognition rather than confrontation. His eyes moved across her stance with slow precision, reading weight placement, shoulder symmetry, and micro-adjustments that most people never noticed. He spoke with a tone that carried neither accusation nor softness, only truth. "You've been working very hard to stay in the background," he said, each word deliberate. "But skill at your level refuses to stay hidden." His statement hung in the air, settling over the recruits like dust after a controlled detonation. She remained silent, not out of defiance, but out of discipline. Silence, she knew, protected more than words ever could. The commander continued, stepping half a pace closer, but maintaining the boundary that acknowledged her experience. "Your performance today wasn't luck, nor instinct, nor exceptional athletic ability. It was conditioning, long-term, repetitive, purposeful, and far beyond the standard pipeline." A few recruits inhaled sharply, their reactions small but noticeable, though none dared speak. The instructor remained perfectly still, understanding that the commander's tone signaled a shift from evaluation to confirmation. Then, with calm precision, the commander finished the thought. Your former special operations. The clearing seemed to contract, pulling their attention inward as the words hit with the weight of quiet truth. Every recruit felt the impact, recognizing instantly that whatever assumptions they had formed about her had been painfully incomplete. The shift in their expressions was unmistakable shock, disbelief, then a dawning respect that carried the gravity of something earned rather than granted. She held her ground, offering nothing beyond a steady gaze, her breathing controlled and even. She didn't flinch, didn't lift her chin, didn't attempt to correct or counter the assumption. Instead, she simply existed within the space created by truth, her silence confirming more than any admission could have. The commander exhaled slowly, as though acknowledging a long-held suspicion finally brought to light. And not just any operator, he continued. Your movement profile isn't Army, Air Force, or Marine Corps. It's maritime. Clean transitions, anticipatory corrections, and load handling shaped by ship deck dynamics. He studied her again, but this time with a deeper, sharper recognition. Naval Special Warfare. A muted ripple swept through the recruits, some taking half steps back while others leaned unconsciously forward, drawn by the gravity of what they were hearing. None of them had trained beside a former member of such a unit, and few had ever imagined they would. The commander's voice lowered, his tone respectful in a way that only someone familiar with the sacrifices of such units could achieve. 2 decades, if my estimation is accurate. 20 years of operational conditioning don't disappear easily. For the first time, something almost imperceptible shifted in her expression, an echo of memory crossing her eyes before disappearing behind the iron calm she carried like armor. She spoke softly, her voice steady and controlled. I served, a long time ago. It's not relevant to the role I hold here. The commander watched her for several seconds, analyzing the boundary she placed around her own history. Maybe not relevant to your role, he said finally, but it explains every detail these soldiers have witnessed today. He stepped back slightly, giving her more room, as though acknowledging a space she had earned through years of discipline rather than rank. His respect was not ceremonial, it was instinctive. The recruits held their formation, but their energy shifted sharply. They were no longer watching a fellow trainee. They were observing someone who had carried a different kind of weight across a different kind of battlefield, someone who had stood in places few ever survived and fewer still spoke about. She did not seek recognition, nor did she attempt to soften the impact of truth. Her shoulders remained level, her breathing controlled, and her stance anchored exactly where it had been since the confrontation began. But her stillness felt different now. It wasn't just discipline. It was history carved into posture. It was experience etched into silence. It was truth revealed without needing to be spoken twice. The commander turned toward the recruits, his voice regaining its firm, instructional tone. What you've seen today isn't a challenge to surpass, he said. It's an example of what discipline sustained over decades becomes. He let the words settle, understanding that none of them fully grasped what they were witnessing, but all of them felt it. A shift. A realization. A quiet, humbling respect. He faced her once more, offering a small nod, not of superiority, but of acknowledgement between warriors who recognized the same burden carried in different ways. You've earned the right to remain private, he said quietly, and I won't ask more than you're willing to share. She nodded once, a single, intentional motion that carried the weight of acceptance. The clearing remained utterly silent, the recruits absorbing every detail with awe they didn't bother hiding anymore. She didn't smile. She didn't change posture. She didn't revel in the moment. She simply existed within the truth now spoken aloud. A truth she had never needed them to know, but one they would never forget.